Wars vs. Star Trek, Episode 3, Cardassian Invasion. Admiral Cody was assigned to ascertain the Cardassian defenses. He came up with a strategy of using small Nebulon-class B frigates as well as small Imperial Star Destroyers to test the defenses of the Cardassian Union. He used medium-class cruisers as well as old dreadnoughts in order to test the defenses of the Cardassian Empire, to ascertain how much forces would be necessary to break their lines. The Cardassians had 5 star bases as well as a dozen or so orbital defense platforms and over 350 Galar-class cruisers as well as 1,000 support vessels, being of Hidiki-class or starfighters. The Romulan Star Empire also supported the Cardassian fleet with several dreadnoughts, but around 250 Romulan-class cruisers were supporting the Cardassian forces at this choke point. After Cody's fleet ascertained the strength of the defenses of the Cardassian and Romulan Empire, the second part of the plan was to begin. After several attempts to break the line failed, Admiral Cody decided to pull back and secure the hyperspace lane in the middle of the 2 galaxies. Admiral Bro was called to set up a defensive perimeter around the hyperspace lane. 4 Golem Defense Platform Type 3s were set up, with 5 interdictors, starships systematically turning on their interdictor systems, never leaving the lane open, and pulling any ship into the kill zone. A fleet of 5 Star Destroyers and 1 Super Star Destroyer and 300 support ships supported the interdictor ships, completely cutting off all ties to the new galaxy. The lane was mined so heavily that not even a starfighter could make it through. This was to stop shuttles with cloaking devices from making it out of hyperspace. 3 other choke points were set up with 2 platforms and 20 dreadnoughts from the Clone Wars era, with 3 interdictors and 50 support ships, just in case something made it through. The Cardassian-Romulan lines were too powerful for the Empire to break. They had every advantage you can imagine. They had the range and they had the firepower. They outclassed the Imperial-class ships by a large percentile. The orbital defenses were incredibly powerful. The shields aboard the vessels were much stronger than that in the Star Wars ships. The Imperial-class forces had sent several fleets to ascertain how powerful the Cardassian defense was, and they had ascertained that there was no way that they could break it with the strategies that they were using. What was happening to the Imperial vessels is they were coming in out of hyperspace, and they were not even getting into range to even fire. The Cardassian vessels can fire up to 200,000 kilometers, and their orbital defense platforms are so powerful that once ships did make it into firing range, they were obliterated almost instantaneously by the Cardassian orbital defenses as well as the Romulan disruptors. Their weapon output levels were in the 100,000 terawatt levels. Imperial-class Star Destroyers' most powerful turbo lasers were only around 30,000 terawatts, and their standard heavy turbo lasers were only around 6,700. They were by no means comparable to the Cardassian forces or the Romulans. They were being obliterated and they didn't know what to do. After speaking to Grand Admiral Thrall, he had put Admiral Joey, a specialist in tactics, in order to devise a plan in order to break the line. After ascertaining the differences between the 2 ships and the 2 classes, Joey came up with a 3-point plan for Admiral Cody to engage the forces by bringing several Imperial-class Super Star Destroyers in order to stoke up as much damage as possible, then bringing a fleet behind them of Imperial-class Star Destroyers as well as large carriers, and then a 3rd fleet of smaller support vessels completely loaded with TIE fighters and TIE bombers and advanced bomber-class vessels. Then the fleets would engage the Cardassian forces by allowing the Imperial-class Star Destroyers and the Imperial-class Super Star Destroyers to soak up as much damage while they transmit the fleet's coordinates to the smaller vessels. support, the cruisers, the battle cruisers, the carriers. They would warp in, or actually, they would hyperspace with a mini jump right on top of the Cardassian forces. And then the Imperial class superstar destroyers and the star destroyers would then make their way into the battle while distracting them with tens of thousands of fighters and hundreds of Imperial class cruisers and vessels of that nature and small dreadnoughts. After the fleet is engaged and is distracted, the Empire will bring in its trump card, the Death Star. The Death Star will then fire upon the planet, destroying the planet with the Cardassian Romulan fleet, as well as the small Imperial fleet and fighters engaging the vessels. Then another fleet will then come in and wipe out the remaining Cardassian vessels. They'll still have the Imperial class Star Destroyer fleet, they'll still have the Super Star Destroyers that would have only lost their support vessels, and then they can bring another fleet of support vessels in order to start engaging the remaining Cardassian vessels and destroy them. Immediately after taking this space, they'll begin bringing massive amounts of forces in order to hold the line to defend the space that they now have acquired from the Cardassians by bringing in several Imperial class super dreadnoughts. Immediately after this Imperial victory, the Empire would begin attacking multiple systems. They had taken vessels and they had salvaged coordinates from Cardassian ships that were destroyed or captured after the battle. They now had a decent idea of certain systems or closed systems, and they were able to use hyperspace coordinates and coordinates around planetary environments. They were able to hit systems within the Cardassian border. They started taking territory around the Cardassian border. There is heavy ground fighting by Admiral Wesley. Admiral Wesley was appointed to bring the ground forces upon the Cardassian forces. They came across many issues. The worlds were very well guarded, and they had transporter technology, which made it hard for the Imperial forces to pin down the Cardassians, but the Cardassians eventually were brought down. The Imperial forces were forced to use mass numbers in order to take out the Cardassian forces. The Cardassian forces were armed with just phasers and mini torpedo launchers, which were very effective against Imperial class walkers, which were unshielded. Eventually, they were able to take only a few systems in the Cardassian space, and they began pushing in the outer rim. The reason for this is that the Cardassian forces were just too hard to pull in further, and they were taking too heavy of casualties. They were forced to pull back and began spreading their forces and taking easier targets in order to bring a better hold inside this new universe. The Empire and the Cardassian fighting continued. The Empire did hold back and did not push any further than the systems it did grab that were on the rim of the Cardassian Empire. These systems were not as well guarded and were pretty easy targets for the Empire. Cardassians did bring their fleet down and were holding off the Empire. The Empire was not able to push any further due to the massive Cardassian forces now appointed there. They didn't focus their attention onto the smaller systems that were either not guarded or very lightly guarded. Whenever they came across larger empires, for an example like the Temerians, they would not engage them or pick any kind of fights with the Caterians or the Temerians. Any empire that did withstand or have a decent sized army was left alone, and peace treaties were attempted to be established. The Empire began spreading its forces rather quickly, gathering systems like Galanor, which was very close to the Federation. They didn't know the Federation or know anything about them. They knew that they were some kind of combined government like the old Republic. They continue spreading their forces right up against the border of the Federation, and they continue to try to proceed with forces within the Cardassian Union holding their ground. Due to the amount of destruction caused by the Death Star and the fear of this weapon, the Romulans pulled out and left the Cardassians to defend themselves. Imperial forces began grabbing as much land as possible. The Federation, noticing that the Cardassians and wanting to not get involved in another race's war, but wanted to watch and try to figure out what was going on, began sending ships and using deep space scanners, probing and watching the Empire, as well as hijacking some of the Imperial frequencies and listening into the war, trying to get an idea of what was going on. It just seemed like this superpower came out of nowhere. To the Federation, it was almost as if this race had taken over hundreds of planets in a short amount of time, and there was a considerable amount of fear that there would be another war with another race, like the Cardassian War that they had just gotten out of, and there was fear that there was going to be another war with the Dominion, and now this other empire had come out of nowhere. The Federation was also concerned if possible this empire could be part of the Dominion. So they began scramblizing forces and putting them on their edge of their borders in order to deter the Empire. Several Federation fleets were put along the borders. Eventually, the Empire did reach Starfleet. They did try to take and seize some of Starfleet's systems, but to their surprise, the Federation was much stronger than the Cardassians or the Romulans. Their vessels were incredibly powerful ships with incredibly powerful shields, as well as many of these ships used something referred to as phaser emitters. These weapons were able to calibrate their phasers to low energy or high energy bars and were able to hit targets with pinpoint accuracy. They were able to destroy fighters instantaneously, and they obliterated the small forces that were grabbing or attempting to grab the Federation systems. The Federation was able to completely and utterly push back the Empire, with them gaining nothing in these small border disputes. Starfleet was able to push back the Empire. They did not want another war. They had met with Lord Vader to discuss a peace treaty. After the discussion of a peace treaty, the Empire and the Federation had met with the actual Emperor, who had met with the Federation leadership in order to negotiate trade and peace treaty. The Federation was more than willing to give in to the demands of the Empire to stop from another pointless war. The Empire agreed to no longer engage Federation-related stations or colonies or races that were associated with the Federation. A complete another peace treaty and borders were established. The Emperor also met with the Cardassians, with the Federation negotiating on their behalf for peace as well. The Cardassians were willing to do this, perfectly knowing that the Empire and themselves were just holding back in order to build their forces. But the Cardassians had to take this opportunity because the Empire had destroyed so many of their ships, and they did need time to rebuild. The Romulans agreed to a ceasefire as well, and the Ferengi Alliance agreed to negotiate trading agreements with the Empire. Unknown to the Empire, though, the Dominion had began to infiltrate the Empire. They started building rebel cells, they started taking over governors, and they started taking over Imperial officers, and eventually huge amounts of unrest began to appear in the Star Wars universe. And the Empire had no idea what was going on. strange occurrences. Buildings would explode, people would disappear, ships would disappear, fleets would not show up. It was utter chaos was going on the Empire's side. So much so that it put a complete and utter halt to the Empire spreading its forces in the Star Wars universe and the Star Trek universe.